Welcome everybody to the first conversation in Men Can Stop Rape's National Healthy Masculinity Conversation Series. My name is Pat McGann. I'm the Director of Strategy and Planning for Men Can Stop Rape. In 2012, Men Can Stop Rape organized and launched the Healthy Masculinity Action Project, reaching more than 60 million people and igniting an international healthy masculinity movement. I want to take a minute to familiarize you with Men Can Stop Rape before we jump into the conversation. So I'm going to jump into a PowerPoint for a second and talk a little bit about Men Can Stop Rape. We've been around since 1997. We're based in Washington, D.C. One of the things that we're especially known for is our award-winning MOST Club. It stands for Men of Strength Club. And it's a youth development program, which is part of the work that we do. It exists in DC and in 28 states. The 24-session curriculum of the club provides middle, high school, and college-age males with a structured and supportive space to learn about healthy masculinity. And then you also see there WISE, which stands for Women Inspiring Strength and Empowerment. It's structured similarly to the MOST Club, but is for high school girls or young women. And it's based in DC. It only exists in DC. And then you see below that counter stories. One of the things that MOST Club and WISE Club members do together is community strength projects. So it's not just about building awareness, but also about taking action. Counter Stories is an award-winning documentary style series that presents positive, authentic counter messages through an exploration of art, culture, and social justice in their lives. And then we also do technical assistance work. Here, you'll see this represents our work that we do through the Office on Violence Against Women, specifically with community organizations that are part of the Consolidated Youth and Engaging Men program. And then we do TA in other ways as well. You'll see here our Healthy Masculinity resource bundles, which grew out of the 10 years of federal work we've done in terms of technical assistance. And the bundles offer organizations, agencies, schools, and businesses the tools and technical assistance to implement more effective healthy masculinity programming. And then we do trainings as well. We've done trainings and workshops, presentations in all 50 states. We also have trainings that we do twice a year, the Healthy Masculinity Training Institute. This is our most in-depth training around healthy masculinity. And we've got one coming up in January 6th through 8th. You can learn more about it at our website, mcsr.org. We also do public education. You'll see here, the banner is from our unique bystander intervention and consent campaign called Where Do You Stand? That's specifically intended for young men and boys and focuses on their role in preventing sexual assault, dating violence, and cyber stalking. And we've been doing those public education campaigns specifically for men and boys since 2001. This is just the most recent one. We've done ones for the military and adapted various campaigns that we've done for state organizations, coalitions, community organizations. You'll see here, ASK stands for Assault Services Knowledge. It's a first of its kind website and mobile application available in 5 regions across the country. Offers community-specific sexual assault, domestic violence, intimate partner violence resources, all in one place in that app. And UASK is the college version of the app that's currently used on 12 campuses. And then finally, in collaboration with numerous partners and as a special project of the DC Coalition to End Sexual Violence, Men Can Stop Rape has created Nameless, a documentary that addresses child sex trafficking in Washington, DC and at large. And we'd like to invite you to watch the digital premiere of the film this Friday, November 22nd. You see the link to do that down there, mcsr.org/digital-premiere. Or if you just do a search on nameless digital premiere, various options will come up to watch that movie this Friday. So now let me get out of this and bring Sarah back up. And we're obviously also doing this series of conversations, which provides a space to continue discussing how healthy masculinity can be best used now and in the future. How do people understand and effectively use healthy masculinity? How successful we've been at spreading healthy masculinity to multiple areas of social activity? What will healthy masculinity mean for the 2020s? Today, I'm really excited to be in conversation with Dr. Sarah DeGue. I've heard her speak numerous times and always been impressed, and that's why I invited her to be part of this conversation. I'm really happy that she accepted. She's a senior scientist in the research and evaluation branch of the Division of Violence Prevention in the National Center for Injury Prevention and Control, and lead for CDC's Dating Matters Teen Dating Violence Prevention Initiative. Her work focuses primarily on the etiology and prevention of sexual violence. Key efforts have included a systematic review of primary prevention strategies for sexual violence perpetration, a review of alcohol policy approaches to sexual violence prevention, a systematic review of sexual violence risk and protective factors, which of course is central to the conversation we're going to have today, an economic estimate of the societal costs of sexual violence, and CDC's first technical package to prevent sexual violence. So for the next hour or so, we'll be discussing healthy masculinity's relationship with sexual violence risk and protective factors. If you have any questions, please tweet them to Men Can Stop Rape's Twitter account at Men Can Stop Rape, and use the hashtag HMSeries or hashtag healthy masculinity, and we'll respond to as many of those as we can towards the end of the conversation. So let me turn to Sarah now and start out just by asking or bringing up how, when people learn where I grew up, it's not unusual for them to wonder how a guy from Lubbock, Texas got interested in masculinity and preventing sexual assault, domestic violence, and other forms of gender-based violence. It's a question you get a lot. And so I thought it'd be a question I'd turn to you with too. What led you, what in the world led you to get interested in the risk and protective factors related to sexual violence?
Well, thank you first for having me here today. It's really exciting to be a part of this first conversation, and I always appreciate the work that Men Can Stop Rape does, and so I'm really excited to talk with you today. So I did not start off my career in public health, though I've been doing that for quite a while now. I'm actually trained as a clinical forensic psychologist, and so my career started with an interest in criminal offenders and mental health issues related to the criminal justice system. And at that time, much of my research had really focused on risk factors for sexual violence perpetration. Specifically, I was looking at shared and unique risk factors for different forms of sexual violence in both college and incarcerated populations. And so I thought that work was really important because understanding risk and protective factors is critical to informing effective prevention and intervention strategies, though I was not doing that at that point, right? So when I came to CDC in 2008 and really shifted my focus towards public health and prevention, my colleagues and I recognized a need in the field, and really for our own purposes in our own work, to synthesize the 30 plus years of research on risk and protective factors that existed at that time for sexual violence, and to help us really identify where the strongest evidence was. And particularly, we wanted to kind of bridge these different sets of literatures that existed at the time and still do on, college students, incarcerated offenders, community samples, adolescents, that were all sort of separate literatures and hadn't been really looked at together. And we did that and published a review in 2013, this really helped us to define the work that we're doing here at CDC using the public health approach to sexual violence prevention since that time.
So the risk and protective factors really, I'm just thinking, I'm going to switch probably, I think, to the public health approach and probably how it fits in that. I know some of the people are probably familiar with that, but I feel like in terms of laying a foundation, it's fairly important. And then I think we'll probably talk about the socio-ecological model after that, which I think I became familiar with before the risk and protective factors. I think, if I remember right. So I'll probably want to talk about that a little bit later. And I think it's interesting how so many of us are doing this work didn't start out intending to do this work. Same for me, obviously. My PhD is in language literacy and rhetoric, which is really doesn't have a whole lot to do with, well, I think it has more to do with the work than might be obvious, but certainly it wasn't a direct connection, although I was interested in masculinity and studying those sorts of things. So so if you can talk a little bit about that public health approach and kind of the idea of the risk and protective factors in relation to sexual violence within that public health approach, which I think is really important in terms of healthy masculinity. I think it's there's a reason we use health, I think, in terms of healthy masculinity, and we also say unhealthy masculinity. And for us, that's because of that public health approach. So if you could share a little bit about that.
Yeah, so the public health approach and the socio-ecological model are kind of the two main models that drive our work in the Division of Violence Prevention at CDC. And the public health approach to violence prevention is basically a 4-step iterative kind of process that's rooted in the scientific method. And one of those steps is around risk and protective factors. But the first step is really defining the problem. So sort of understanding who's affected by the problem, how often does it happen, what does the problem look like? And for sexual violence, we do that primarily with the National Intimate and Partner in Sexual Violence Survey, NISFIS, where we get surveillance data, kind of giving us an idea of what's happening with sexual violence in the world. And then the second step, and what we're talking about today, is identifying risk and protective factors. And just to make it clear for everyone, risk factors are characteristics, contexts, behaviors, or other factors that are kind of linked to a greater likelihood of sexual violence perpetration. And we think of them as correlates or as contributing factors, but not so much necessarily as direct causes. We don't have a lot of research to really tell us what's causal and what's not, but they're factors that are related to perpetration and increase it. And then protective factors, in contrast, are factors that lessen the likelihood of sexual violence, victimization, or perpetration. And they might also serve as buffers against risk factors. So knowing this kind of information, what characteristics, behaviors, and contexts place individuals and communities at risk is critical knowledge when we're developing prevention strategies. And we know that prevention strategies that are more likely to be effective when they do address these known risk and protective factors as the target outcomes. So in the third step of the public health model, we take that information on risk and protective factors and we use it to develop and test prevention strategies that directly address those factors. And then when we find something that works, we ideally disseminate that model to kind of try to ensure widespread adoption, reach more people, and hopefully see more population level effects. So that's essentially the public health model and why we really see risk and protective factors as a critical piece of the work that we do. And it really underlies everything in a lot of ways.
So it's really important that people understand the concept, the idea of the risk and protective factors and application, just in terms of really, if you're going to do prevention in the way that you're suggesting, that you really have to kind of comprehend what the role that those play. And it's the same with the social ecological model. I think there are two kind of models that I know of that have been really influential in terms of prevention work, and the social ecological model is one, and the CDC really was, I think, pushing that out in the early 2000s. And then the other is the spectrum of prevention, which I used both at various times. I think they're both useful in terms of really understanding or valuing the need for a comprehensive approach,
Mhm.
recognizing that you need to work at different levels.
Yep, absolutely.
So, and that's something that Men Can Stop Rape has been invested in for a long time. You know, it's not just one workshop and you're done, or it's, you know, not just doing workshops, but a lot of other things as well. So if you could share, you know, a little bit about those social ecological model role and because when we get to the risk and protective factors, they're categorized according to the different levels of the social ecological model. So if you talk maybe a little bit about why that is.
Yeah, sure. So just for anyone who hasn't heard of it, the social ecological model was developed to explain the ways that different factors interact and influence our health and behavior across our lifespan. And it includes 4 levels: individual level, relationship level, community, and societal. And the theory basically posits that our health and behavior is influenced by factors across each of these levels and that they interact with each other. So, of course, your behavior is influenced by your own characteristics like your personality and your attitudes, but it's also affected by characteristics of your family and your peers, your community, your neighborhood. And so all these factors kind of come together to influence the behavior that we see and also the risk and protective factors. So we can then identify risk and protective factors within each of these levels. So an individual level risk factor would be a characteristic of an individual that would increase his or her risk, and a community level risk factor would be a characteristic of the community itself that's associated with risk at the community level. So you know, I'm sure you know that historically most prevention programs have focused on really individual level factors, a lot of times knowledge and education, attitudes. But we know that it's really important to work across all of these levels and to address the links between individual behaviors and the various kind of physical and social contexts that influence it. And that's partly because we know, you know, your individual behavior doesn't occur in a vacuum. If you have the greatest of intentions, you can still be influenced by family or a community that works against those intentions. And so addressing all of the risk levels is really important. And that's essentially what we refer to as a comprehensive strategy. That's a strategy that's multi-level, has multiple components, and addresses risk and protective factors at each level of the social ecology.
Which can be really hard to do, I think.
Yes. Easier said than done.
Yeah, easier said than done. Yes, you know, depending on resources and other factors as well that can come into
And you know,
play.
one organization, one program doesn't need to do all of that themselves.
Right.
A comprehensive strategy can exist across a community with different organizations doing different pieces. As long as they're kind of all there and working together, it has the same kind of function and outcome, hopefully.
Mm-hmm. Or across a state, or
absolutely.
you know, within a school, or or you know, community of schools, a school system, things like that, which can also be challenging. But I think it's important to have the kind of concept there and the strive to do it as much as you can. And I think we've kind of laid the foundation, but now to me we kind of begin to get into the most interesting part. And we want to start digging into the risk and protective factors. And there are different social ecological categories, as well as Men Can Stop Rape's description of healthy masculinity, and start to kind of tease out what are the connections, and how does all this kind of fit together? Does it fit together? So we started developing our description of healthy masculinity in 2012 during and after the Healthy Masculinity Action Project, which I mentioned earlier. And I would say that the description is loosely based on Latané's and Darley's 1970 5-step model for bystander intervention, which you know, I think a lot of people are familiar with, especially since bystander intervention has become so popular. Notice events, identify events as problems, feel motivated to and capable of acting, and then acquire skills to act, and then, of course, act. But I think there are some significant differences in the sense that our description really takes into account gender socialization. and transformation related to masculinity. And so that gender lens we feel like is really important just in terms of socialization and how do we address that. And so both the risk and protective factors and description of healthy masculinity were sent to everybody ahead of time. So you should have those. There may be a few people we missed. I think those went out about 11 o'clock, and I think a few people RSVP'd after that. But I'm not going to go over them in detail because there are a lot of risk factors, and especially risk factors. But I will mention some just at the different levels so that we have those to talk about. Individual risk factors: alcohol and drug use, delinquency, lack of empathy, general aggressiveness and acceptance of violence, coercive sexual fantasies, exposure to sexually explicit media, hostility towards women, adherence to traditional gender role norms, healthy masculinity, relationship factors, family environment, which you mentioned earlier, childhood history of physical, sexual, or emotional abuse, emotionally unsupportive family environment, association with sexually aggressive, hypermasculine, delinquent peers, community factors, poverty, lack of employment opportunities, lack of institutional support from police and judicial system, general tolerance of sexual violence within the community, societal factors, societal norms that support sexual violence, societal norms that support male superiority in sexual entitlement, societal norms that maintain women's inferiority in sexual submissiveness, weak laws and policies related to sexual violence, gender equity, protective factors for perpetration. And again, this comes from the list that is on the CDC website. Parental use of reasoning for resolving family conflict, emotional health and connectedness, academic achievement, empathy and concern for how one's actions affect others. So those are some of the risk and protective factors. In terms of Men Can Stop Rape's description of healthy masculinity, recognizing unhealthy aspects of masculinity that are harmful to the self and others. So it's really about awareness to action, which is a phrase that we've used for a long time, empathizing with self and others, supporting gender equity and other forms of equity, which for us is really important just in terms of, in our thinking, one of the root causes is seeing people as less than, because when you see somebody as less than, it's much easier to abuse them or mistreat them, ridicule, harm them, hurt them. And so that supporting gender equity and other forms of equity is really important in relation to that, as is empathizing. Replacing harmful, risky, and violent masculine attitudes and behaviors with emotionally intelligent attitudes and behaviors that respect the self and others, and then learning and using emotional and social skills to constructively challenge unhealthy masculine attitudes and behaviors. And so, I think there's some obvious overlap in the list, but and we can obviously talk about those a little bit. And there may be some overlap that's less explicit or less obvious. And I'd like to kind of talk about that possibility as well. But so, what do you see in terms of those lists, both the risk and protective factors, and then the list of qualities or characteristics we associate with healthy masculinity?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think there's definitely a lot of overlap. It's, it's in some sense, it's completely overlapping in that the definition that you have, really each point of it describes an action that either reduces risk or by addressing a risk factor, or improves or develops some kind of protective factor, right? So I think it aligns amazingly well with the research that we have. So empathy, gender equity, emotional health, psychosocial skills, those are all risk and protective factors that we've identified in the research as really important, and that kind of underscore the definition that you have here. One thing that struck me about your definition that's really interesting is that it's really defined behaviorally. Like you talked about, was an action to I forget what you just said.
Awareness to action.
Awareness to action. Thank you. That's a great phrase, even though I forgot it. But you know, it's really clear from your definition of healthy masculinity that's really defined as a set of behaviors that you engage in to improve these various factors. And I think that's interesting because in the research literature, there's certainly no consensus definition on healthy masculinity. And in fact, most of the research evidence does not address that at all. And it's really more focused on the culturally dominant or traditional male gender norms. But those definitions that do exist tend to focus more on attitudes and beliefs than on behaviors. And so I just think that's a really interesting contribution to kind of think about not what the end product is necessarily of having a healthy masculine ideology, but kind of how do you get there? And it seems more focused on that process to me than it is on, you know, defining something that exists. So it's unique in that way, but it certainly overlaps substantially with the risk factors that the research has identified.
Well, that's interesting because I actually hadn't thought about it that way. In terms of focusing on behavior and not necessarily the end product, but it's really more about process is what I'm hearing you say. Is that...
that was the intention, but that was the sense that I got. When I first read it, I was sort of struck by the action-oriented nature of the definition in contrast to the definitions that I've seen in the literature otherwise, which are much usually more a list of traits or of beliefs and attitudes that individuals adhere to. And so it's unique in that way. But I think it's actually kind of useful because then it also lays out a map for how you get there, for what you're addressing with your various prevention strategies as well, that you know exactly what it is you're trying to get to, right?
Well, and I'm curious too about the last one, and I actually crossed out. There was a statement or a phrase at the end expressed by others in that last one: learning and using emotional and social skills to constructively challenge unhealthy masculine attitudes and behaviors expressed by others. And I thought, I'm inclined to cross that out and leave that broader, so that it's not just thought of in terms of bystander intervention in a traditional sort of sense, where the individual is challenging something that another person has said or done. But it's also about, like I mentioned earlier, our Men of Strength Club and our WISE clubs and doing community strength projects. So it would fit in. I think it would incorporate that as well, so that it's not just the individual, but it's also, leaves it open to doing something at community level or.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. That makes sense. It's sort of the collective version of that as well. But that piece of it really does seem important to me because in looking at this literature recently, for part of a project that I'll probably talk about in a little bit that we're doing here at CDC, it seems that a set of skills that will be really important for boys to have, younger boys specifically, when they're trying to adopt a healthy masculine ideology, is the skill to kind of push back against the pressure to conform to the culturally dominant norms, right? And that those skills are not really only applied to other people, but they're sort of applied to oneself also, that you need the skills to be able to challenge those norms within yourself, to recognize when you're affected by them, and then also to resist the pressure from society, from peers, from family, from everywhere to conform to those dominant expectations. So that seems like an important set of skills. And just in terms of risk factors for sexual violence, we had there's a broad literature across youth violence and sexual violence and other areas addressing adolescence, particularly that's around like just social emotional learning, social emotional skills, and how many different health outcomes and behavioral outcomes can be prevented by addressing those skills deficits that a lot of kids have. So I think that that's helpful across the board, even if not even in addition to being specific to the kind of the gender context.
Mm-hmm. Although there are ways, certainly, in which men and boys are socialized to experience emotions, you know, and in terms of those dominant, what were you saying, dominant expectations? Yeah, we use dominant stories and counter stories.
Oh, okay. That's
so, which you know they grab onto, you know, and sometimes they'll challenge, like in the Most Club, they'll challenge the facilitator and say, "Oh, you're acting out a dominant story." And so it's an easy framework for them to grab hold of, you know, and really kind of embrace. And then that counter story is really the basis for us of healthy masculinity. And our assumption is that those counter stories are always present in any experiences of boys and men, that you just have to kind of uncover them, highlight them, lift them up, and really kind of build something out of them. A lot of times I think they get overshadowed by those dominant expectations or dominant stories, or, you know, whatever you want to call them. Right. Can you talk a little bit about, I really think, you know, when I mean, this may just be me. I like to think this way, but, and I think you were kind of suggesting this a little bit earlier, but, you know, when you look at this list of, say, risk factors, it's really easy to think of it as static, that everything is separate from everything else. And I want to at least consider the possibility that that's not the case. That there are ways in which the list is fluid, and, you know, these different parts interact with each other in important ways and then, you know, that's something we should consider just in terms of how we understand the work. And so let me just kind of stop there. I mean, I think, like, for us, for instance, just as an example, even though, you know, there's no mention of masculinity in terms of alcohol, which is one of the risk factors, obviously there are ways for us in which that can be connected to masculinity in terms of socialization. I mean, college campuses, you certainly hear alcohol is really prominent in terms of sexual assault cases. And we know that there are differences in terms of the genders, and in terms of women who have been drinking, how they're perceived, versus men who've been drinking, how they're perceived. So that social norms piece kind of comes into play. At the same time, there's the individual part. So how do you weave all that together?
Yeah. So I definitely understand your question. I think part of the issue is in understanding something like this kind of list that we're looking at of risk and protective factors that's organized this way, is that this is by no means a complete or comprehensive list of risk and protective factors. It's basically just a summary of those factors that have the most consistent research evidence behind them, and placed at the level where they're typically measured for research purposes, or where the most evidence exists. But social norms, of course, exist. And while they're placed on this list primarily under societal factors, they exist at every level of the social ecology, right? And they influence our behavior at every level. So we have social norms in our family, in our peer group, in our immediate community, which might be a neighborhood or a city. It could be a social community like a church or a school, or it could be even an online community. There's social norms in all of these different contexts, not just at the societal level, that influence all of our behavior. So, for example, societal norms about masculinity, or at these other levels, definitely could affect the likelihood of individual level alcohol abuse by men, the motivation for it, the outcome of it, in a lot of different ways, right? So all of these things interact. And that's kind of the basis of the social ecological model, is that none of these things exist in isolation. They're all constantly influencing each other across and within the levels. So I think that addressing social norms specifically is really important, not only at the societal level, but at these lower levels. And actually addressing them at the lower levels might be kind of the best starting place, because it's pretty hard to change societal level norms off the bat, right? And so most of the strategies that we see and that we work on are focused on changing social norms at those lower levels, where individuals can have more influence and they can collectively work to change social norms and societal norms in the long run. Societal norms specifically are, they're not typically a top-down kind of standard that's laid out for behavior. They're more of a set of beliefs that are endorsed by a majority of social groups and communities within a society, or in some cases by just those social groups with more social power. And sometimes they're codified into law, but it's really coming from kind of the collective up to the societal level, and then influencing everyone, even where those groups were not the origin of it. So I think the idea behind social norms as a strategy is really to kind of focus on those lower levels and build consensus and encourage change over time within the groups that individuals have influence over, or organizations have influence over, so that the change over time can occur at the societal level. But it's definitely interactive, and for your question.
Yeah, so I think that's really helpful, just in terms of kind of not seeing it as static. And well, first of all, it doesn't include everything, and secondly, but although it includes some really important and significant information, but I assume it's something that continue to be built out more over time.
Exactly. So it's really just represents what's been researched to date, but we know there are many more factors that have not been researched. And so as that literature grows, we have, theories that get tested. We have different kind of ways of looking at this problem, and we can identify additional factors, and they're added to this list. And we can also continue to understand the specific ways in which some of these interact. So we have some ideas about some of these factors already, but because a lot of the research is correlational, we don't always know the specifics of the mechanisms by which these things operate. And so we continue to learn more about that over time as well. And the list, it's definitely not a finished project, that list.
Well, and I want to pose something, and I think it's just a matter of perspective in terms of thinking about working in terms of the social norms part. But it seems to me, if you've got many people who I think we think of doing like workshops or trainings, can be working at kind of the individual level. But if you've got many people doing that, it seems to me that that's much broader than just, it includes the individual level, but there's another perspective where, it's much broader than that potentially.
Right. That's where it potentially becomes a community level strategy or community-based strategy, anyways, where you're really influencing community level norms if you are having enough reach to influence the entire community, not just the people who are participating in the program, not just their maybe direct relationships, but once you start changing the norms at the community level, that would be considered a community level strategy. And again, a community can be a school, or it can be a city, or it can be a state. Community can be defined a lot of different ways, and so it doesn't have to be the goal to be, changing all of societal norms to find success with this. But as we extend the reach of these models, and they're designed to kind of have those kinds of influences beyond the individual participants, that's where we can see the broader population level effects starting to happen.
So if you have let's say men of strength clubs in an entire school system, then that's changes kind of the how it fits within that kind of socio-ecological model. There are different levels it fits into, not just that one individual level.
Right. If the program is designed to have an influence beyond those men who are participating in the clubs, and that those effects are realized, then it becomes a community level strategy if it includes that kind of influence. but a lot of programs are designed to primarily influence the participants who are in the programs, and or maybe those participants and their partners or their families. Those would be individual or relationship level strategies. So it's sort of about the impact and the level at which the impact is intended and occurs to define whether something is an individual, relationship, or community level strategy. But a program can have, like the most clubs could have, a community level impact if it, has the sufficient reach and effectiveness to really change the community itself rather than just individuals.
And can we talk about the protective factors for a minute? Because when you look at the CDC list, there's when you look at the risk protective factors, there's this long list, and you look at the protective factors, and there's this short list. And I was just wondering if you could speak to that a little bit.
Yeah. So essentially, there's just been less research on protective factors, and that's the main reason that we know less about that. And that's pretty common across all the literatures. Most of the research starts looking at risk factors first and kind of progresses to risk or protective factors, and community level factors come sometimes even later than that. Part of it is just kind of the progress of research, and part of it is that it's a little bit more challenging to measure protective factors and to conceptualize protective factors than it is to identify risk factors. So it's sort of a product of a lack of research and the difficulty of doing that research, I guess, and some of the theory that's behind it. So again, protective factors are those things that either predict a low probability of violence or interact with risk factors to buffer against those effects. And for that reason, it's sometimes can just be hard for researchers to identify what those things might be. It's sort of, if you're looking at something normative, it's more difficult to see that as having an influence than the more unusual kind of risk behaviors that are more clearly linked to the outcomes we're interested in. But and the other thing is that when we do look at risk factors in the research, often they're looked at as kind of the flip side of a risk factor or the absence of a risk factor. So if excessive alcohol use is a risk factor for sexual violence, you might assume that low or no alcohol use is a protective factor, and we could think about it that way. But what we really need to identify are those positive characteristics or influences instead, that when present, instead of when something's absent, make perpetration less likely. So we can promote those things, right? Those are the things that we want to encourage, to teach, to reinforce. And so I think, related to this conversation, that a healthy masculine identity, when it's defined as a positive set of ideals and behaviors, could be important as a protective factor. That identity itself could be a protective factor, but we really still need a lot more research from that positive frame, because the masculine gender role norms have almost exclusively been measured, as we talked about, as a risk factor so far. So we haven't really figured out, I think there's some research, but it's not very typical to measure it in terms of what is positive masculinity and how do you know when it exists, and then you can assess whether or not it's related to a lower incidence of sexual violence perpetration.
Yeah, well, and it makes me think about, in terms of our work, and I think, as you're pointing out, people's inclination is to start in that kind of what's the problem mode, whether you see, there's a lot of talk about toxic masculinity. For us, it's well, what's the positive side? Because, you can talk about toxic masculinity, but it's not going to lead you to a different place necessarily. You need to give some people a direction to go, as opposed to just let them stay stuck in this negative place. And so, that's really what led us to healthy masculinity.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Can you talk a little bit about, I think it's important given you're an evaluator, a researcher, if you can talk about this in terms of evaluation and what are the implications for healthy masculinity in programming and evaluation. You've been talking about that a little bit, but I think there's probably more you could say about it.
Yeah, so I have done, of course, work on risk and protective factors, like I've mentioned, but really most of my work has been on evaluating prevention strategies to examine their effectiveness. And so I think evaluation is really important. It helps us to really know whether what we're doing is actually working, whether our investments in that intervention are paying off. And it also allows us to learn from each other's work better so that effective strategies can be more widely disseminated. People are doing really good work out there, but if we don't know about it, if we don't see any evidence that it works, it's harder for that work to be disseminated in that final step of the public health model, which is assuring widespread adoption. So, rigorous evaluation designs that examine behavioral outcomes are definitely the ideal, and that's the majority of the work that we fund at CDC, because they really allow us to draw these firm conclusions about effectiveness, right? But of course, that's not always like the best place to start, and it's not possible for all organizations doing this work. But program evaluation of some sort is usually within reach, and it doesn't have to be as, making it rigorous and well designed. Doesn't have to be really costly. It might just be adding some well-designed measures or adding another follow-up period beyond the direct post-test. So doing these kind of little things to improve the quality of the research that you can do, the evaluation that you can do, can be really helpful to the field. And CDC does have a really good tool and training called EvaluAction that people should have got a link to before this session, but that tool is available on CDC's Veto Violence website, and it walks communities through the design of an evaluation plan, creating a logic model, kind of all those steps that you need to create a good program evaluation model. And again, like once that data exists, it's really important to share it with your partners, and with the rest of the prevention field by publishing it, if you can, presenting it at conferences or in other venues, putting it on your website so that other people can learn from that work and build better strategies themselves. So the evaluation really at the core of it is making sure we're investing our prevention resources in things that work, and that we are continuing to improve that work over time as we learn more about, what works.
So what I hear you saying, and I want to see if this is accurate. I think that for a long time we've thought that, or see this kind of split between a practitioner and a researcher. And what I hear you saying is, well, there's a third category, and that would be the practitioner researcher.
Yeah.
Who is that accurate?
Definitely exist. Yeah, I mean, they definitely exist, and we, not every practitioner has the tools and training off the bat to do that kind of work and to do it well. And so that's why we're kind of providing these additional tools and training free through CDC, is to try to encourage people to do what they can in this area. Because, you may not be in a position to do a randomized controlled trial off the bat. Few people are, but the more of this kind of pilot data and program evaluation data that you have, you're also getting in a better position to apply for funding, to partner with researchers, to get to the point where you can get that stronger evaluation evidence. And that's really important for us as a public health agency, that when we do identify programs that work, that we can promote, that they really do have to have a strong evidence base for us to not endorse it. We don't do that, I don't think, but to really provide them as an example of strategies that communities can use that we can feel confident are going to have an effect. And so so the evaluation is really important, but you don't have to start with a randomized controlled trial. Pretty much anyone who's doing some kind of prevention activities has the resources to collect some data, to start looking at ways to improve the program, and to start looking at some basic outcomes beyond satisfaction, right? Looking at some behavioral or attitudinal outcomes that give us a sense of whether things are working. And hopefully that research or that evaluation would then progress over time, so they can find partners or find resources to improve it and continue to build on that, so that we can get to a place where we really know that this is the best program of this sort, and that it's doing what we think it's doing.
Yeah, well, and I had no expertise, for instance, doing focus groups.
Me neither.
But yeah, we did
That's why
them.
we have that contractor.
Well, we actually, I did them with the military. I mean, I observed some professionals first of all, and but then thought, okay, I think this is something that I can learn to do, and so we did it with the military. We've done it in terms of our public education campaigns, and we've done it in terms of some federal work that we've done in a number of different capacities. So it is possible to learn that. We're getting some questions, and so I want to kind of jump to those in the last few minutes we have. I was just wondering, well, somebody's asking about speaking about community level interventions a little bit more, and I know I think we wanted to talk about that anyway, because I know, for instance, you talk about, or I've read some of the research where it's, most of the interventions are at the individual and relationship level. And I think you referred a little bit to this earlier, but so, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about that. And in terms of, like, for instance, in terms of healthy masculinity in our Men of Strength clubs, we have them do what we call community strength projects. And the idea is for them to really to take what they've learned and spread it out to their school and really kind of have an impact on the school. Would that be a community level intervention, or are we thinking of that wrong?
I think it could. Yeah, I think it could. So community level strategies are really defined by the risk and protective factors that are being addressed being at the community level. So if you are trying to change a characteristic, not of people in the community per se, but of the community itself, then it's a community level strategy. Community based strategies, in contrast, people get these confused a lot, are really strategies that are implemented in the community, across the community, but they aren't necessarily targeting the community itself for the outcomes. So a program like a project like that, if it's really talking about, changing the school norms, changing some kind of policies or response, school responses to incidents that happen in the school, something like that, then that could be a community level strategy, right? And as I started to allude to earlier, we don't have very much research on protective factors. And for the same reason, we don't have a lot of research really on community and societal level factors either. Most of the factors that are on the list that you shared at the community and societal level are really still based primarily on theory, because those factors are just, again, harder to measure. We need a different kind of research design to get at measuring something that's truly a characteristic of the community or the society versus just the people, aggregating data from the people within it. So it requires stuff like publicly available data or other sources to kind of get at that. So we still have a lot to learn about what the risk factors are at the community and societal levels. But I think that we know plenty to start doing things at those levels. And there's a lot of different things we can do. One of the most obvious paths to me at this point seems to be focusing on changing those social norms to promote positive, healthy, flexible male identities, not only as an option for men, but kind of promoting it as a community standard or an ideal, which is where we're not yet, but we're moving towards, right? And so this might mean things like educating people about the potential harms of rigid gender norms, or changing beliefs and attitudes in the community, or giving people the skills they need to resist pressure to conform or to speak out against harmful norms, or elevating examples of healthy masculinity, right? So these are different kinds of things that we could do to kind of get at that social norms piece at the community level. And another example that I'll share of a possible way to do this is a project that I've started working on recently at CDC, along with one of my colleagues, Dr. Megan Kearns, that's really trying to do this by addressing the development of male gender norms in early childhood. And we recognize that parents are really a major socializing force for children, and that our gender identities, of course, begin to form very early, and they're probably a lot harder to change in early adulthood than they are in early childhood. So with some of our colleagues at CDC and our contractor, Banyan Communications, we're just starting some formative research right now that we hope will help inform the development of a social marketing campaign targeting parents of young boys. And the focus of the campaign will really depend on the results of these focus groups and a literature review that we're still working on right now as well. But the goal is to really help parents understand the importance of raising boys with healthy, positive, flexible male identities in order to protect their own, health, mental health, physical health, and well-being, as well as others, right? So these focus groups, which again, our contractor is doing, because that's not my area of expertise, with parents, we're hoping these parents will help us learn about, what are their beliefs about masculinity. These things change a lot over time. And I think even recently are changing even more quickly than they have in the past. So we want to know, like, what are their beliefs currently? What messages are they communicating to their children about what it means to be a man, right? And what are their boys hearing from other places that they see? And then what interest do they have in raising boys with masculine identities that support their emotional and physical health? So this is all very new, but I'm really excited about this project. And I think it has a lot of potential to help parents raise healthy boys and men, but also as a social marketing campaign, I think it's an example of the kinds of work we can do at the community level and the societal level to promote healthy gender norms, and not just for boys, but for all genders, right? So it's kind of testing this strategy that could be applied in a lot of different ways potentially if we find a successful route.
Well, and as you, I think, point out, the public or the social marketing campaign or public education campaign is certainly community
right.
level intervention.
And that's something that you all have been working on.
Yeah. Let's see. Where do we start? Here's a question. Here in Philly, we are trying to understand how the public health model gets at the structural roots of sexual violence. Say all the risk factors were addressed, would sexual violence then end? You want me to read that again?
Yeah.
Here in Philly, we were trying to understand how the public health model gets at the structural roots of sexual violence. Say all the risk factors were addressed, would sexual violence then end?
That's a great question. I think, getting at the structural factors that underlie violence is very difficult. It's not something that we have exactly figured out how to do yet. And part of that is that we have some ideas about what those factors are for sexual violence specifically and for violence in general. But they're factors that are harder to address with a public health program, right? So factors like poverty, racism, sexism, we can find avenues to get to those underlying root structural issues. But they work slowly. And I think there may be other avenues beyond public health that need to simultaneously work on those issues to really get at the root problems. I think with research, however, we can really continue to try to identify which of these risk factors are really core causal root factors, some of them being structural factors, like the question addressed, but some of them are maybe core kind of root factors that are at the individual or relationship levels or the community level as well. So we have a lot of work to do, I think, to understand what those factors are, and then recognizing that addressing them directly can be very difficult, but that it's most definitely the route that we want to move in and that we continue to try to move in little bits at a time to the best of possible. I think that public health has figured out how to address some of those root causes in other health areas over time, and violence is a newer field of public health. And so I think we're not quite there yet, but see it as a goal.
Right. It's a process is what I hear you saying. And the process is ongoing. And it's going to be for a while. We were at about time. We have a few more questions. I don't think we can answer all of them. Are you okay going about 5 minutes over?
Sure.
Okay. So you may know what ACE is. I'm not knowledgeable about ACE. So if you don't know what ACE is, but what role does ACE play in risk for perpetration of intimate partner violence or sexual assault?
Yeah. So ACEs are adverse childhood experiences. And this is really a focused area of the Division of Violence Prevention and the Injury Center at CDC right now, where we really see ACEs as underlying a lot of the risk factors. And in fact, if you look at some of the factors that are listed in the risk and protective factors that you sent out, many of them are themselves ACEs. So experiencing a family environment and with conflict and violence, a childhood history of child maltreatment, unsupportive family environment, a lot of those relationship level factors. Poverty can be an ACE. So there's a lot of, I think a lot of these factors are directly related to ACEs. And sexual violence itself can be an ACE when it happens in adolescence. And of course, we know that it often does first occur. Victimization often does happen the first time before age 18. So sexual violence is a form of adverse childhood experience, and it is influenced both perpetration and victimization by the other adverse childhood experiences that happen across the lifespan. So it's definitely very relevant. And I think we're increasingly recognizing the effects that ACEs can have on the brain, on behavior, on attitudes and beliefs, on personality development. And so all of these things create either a risk environment or potentially protective environment, depending on what's experienced. So it's definitely something we're attendant to, and I think very relevant to the issue of sexual violence.
It sounds like it's pretty strongly connected. Does the CDC support qualitative evaluation approaches? I brought up focus groups earlier, which would be, I think, considered qualitative. I mean, I assume so, but I don't know.
Yeah, definitely. We do use focus groups for various or qualitative research in different ways. It can be to inform the development of a strategy, like we're doing with the project I just mentioned, using it to inform the development of a social marketing campaign. It could be just to improve the quality of a program. I lead the Dating Matters initiative here, and we conducted focus groups to help us figure out how to improve implementation of the program, improve the program content. Qualitative data can tell us something about the effects of a program, but not typically in the way that we look for when we want to identify the level of effectiveness per se, but it can help us understand how something's working, why it's working, or maybe why it's not working. So it gives us more of that kind of process information on the evaluation side about the quality and nature of an intervention.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's my sense as well. I think we're going to stop with this question. And I think the question is, what are protective factors that are proactive in nature rather than, or instead of reactive? I don't know whether it's just a matter of thinking of the protective factors as proactive, or whether there are ways you kind of seem to suggest in terms of the risk factors. It's like, well, what are the opposite of those risk factors that would be, I think, proactive, but maybe you can speak to that a little bit.
Yeah. Excuse me. So I'm not sure what they mean by proactive per se, but the issue with the protective factors that we've seen that I talked a little bit about is that they do tend to be kind of seen as the opposite of a risk factor. And what we really want to identify and think about are those factors that are positive and that we want to be present. So it's adding something, or it's something that exists rather than something negative not being there, that we want to encourage. So if we can identify what some of those factors are, and I think we really still don't know a lot about that. We have identified a few in the literature, but social connectedness is probably one. Healthy masculine ideology is one. Things like that we can kind of identify and encourage with prevention strategies, I think, or other public health strategies can be really useful in kind of engendering those protective strategies in individuals, so that they are there not only to reduce risk directly for negative health outcomes, but also to buffer against risk that happens outside your control. So if you're experiencing some kind of risk factor at the relationship or community level, if some of these protective factors are present, they may help reduce the effects of those risk factors on your outcomes. So that's
Right.
kind of the
Yeah.
role that they can potentially serve. But we do need to know a lot more about what those are.
Yeah. Well, and I will look forward to learning more about what they are, as everybody will, I suspect, including you.
Yes.
I imagine you'll be really excited, I think, to learn more about what they are.
Definitely.
As will everybody else. So we'll look forward to that further research. I really want to thank you for spending this last little bit over an hour now with us, and this has been a great way to begin this conversation series, and it was really informative to me and interesting, and thank you so much.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for having me. I really think the work that Men Can Stop Rape is doing is really important, and I'm happy to support it and have these kind of dialogues that can help us all learn from each other and keep improving the work we do so we can prevent sexual violence.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Sarah. I want to just quickly go over Men Can Stop Rape and what we do just one more time, very, very quickly before I head out. So let me just pull up the, if I can get it to come up. Let's see. Is it coming up? I don't see it coming up yet. Let's see. Well, there we go. So again, Men Can Stop Rape, based in DC, are Men in Strength and WISE clubs, Women Inspiring Strength and Empowerment. Technical assistance work we do for OVW. We've done that for a long time. And the Healthy Masculinity Resource Bundles, Healthy Masculinity Training Institute coming up in January. Go to our website if you want to learn more about it, mcsr.org. Where Do You Stand? Our public education campaign, most recent one. You can learn more about it at our website, which I just mentioned, and then Ask and You Ask, apps that help address sexual assault, provide sexual assault resources. And then please check out Nameless on Friday, which is about child sex trafficking, and is available. Just do a search for Nameless Digital Premiere and it'll come up. So thanks everybody for joining us. The next conversation will take place in January. And so we hope many of you will join us for that as well. So thanks everybody. Thanks Sarah. And we'll say goodbye now.